This week, a federal judge sentenced Enrique Tarrio, the former leader of the right-wing extremist group the Proud Boys, to 22 years in federal prison for his role in the Capitol attack. It is the most severe sentence yet to come out of the Justice Department's sprawling investigation surrounding January 6th, and is the final sentence to be handed down. And the prosecutors successfully argued that the group organized and ultimately fought at the Capitol to keep their preferred leader in power, no matter what the law or the courts had to say about it. Even though Tarrio wasn't physically at the Capitol on January 6th, the presiding judge described him as the, quote, ultimate leader, the ultimate person who organized, who was motivated by revolutionary zeal. That conspiracy ended up with about 200 men amped up for battle encircling the Capitol. The judge added that Tarrio's punishment was necessary to deter future political violence, saying, quote, it can't happen again. It can't happen again. But the backdrop to Tarrio's sentencing is a moment where political violence is becoming a more prominent feature in America. As Donald Trump's criminal cases unfold, his supporters have escalated their threats of violence online. Pro-Trump message boards have posted the purported names, pictures, and addresses of the Georgia grand jury members. And a woman in Texas was arrested for threatening to kill the judge presiding over one of Donald Trump's federal criminal cases. This kind of radicalization we're seeing is unfortunately not surprising. As the threat of accountability looms over Trump, he and his allies have dug further into an increasingly radical and bleak narrative.
So do you think it's possible that there's open conflict? We seem to be moving towards something.
I don't know, because I don't know what it, I can say this. There's a level of passion that I've never seen. There's a level of hatred that I've never seen, and that's probably a bad combination.
We need to be taking action right now, because if we don't, our constituencies are going to be fighting it in the streets. Do you want a civil war? I don't want a civil war. I don't want to have to draw my rifle.
Do you want us to be in civil war? Because that's what's going to happen. We're not going to keep putting up with this.
If these tactics end up working to keep Trump from winning or even running in 2024, it is going to be the last American election that will be decided by ballots rather than bullets.
So we're at a point, as you just heard there, where casual references to civil war have become far too common among right-wing pundits. It's a reminder that Trump and his supporters continue to fan these flames despite the consequences. Joining me now is MSNBC national security analyst and former FBI assistant director for counterterrorism, Frank Figliuzzi. Frank, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. I want to start with what you make of the sentence that the district judge settled on. Were you surprised it is far below what prosecutors asked for, or was this something that people in law enforcement feel is satisfactory given what they did?
So, Jen, there's at least a couple of ways to look at the sentence. First, I think overall on a macro level, it's a win for anybody that supports accountability and consequences for what happened on January 6th. So that's a good thing. Secondly, as you said, it is in fact the longest sentence we've had so far related to the violence of January 6th. Only next in line is Stewart Rhodes, the leader of Oath Keepers. But, comma, and there is always a comma here, the judge seemed not to totally accept the notion that this was related to domestic terrorism. So even though we don't have a law federally against domestic terror, the prosecutors asked for what's called a terrorism enhancement. That is, at the sentencing phase, a judge can tack on extra time if he thinks the acts were related to domestic terrorism. And he openly, from the bench, wasn't sure about whether this constituted domestic terrorism. My position, Jen, is this January 6th should be in the dictionary next to the phrase domestic terrorism. If that wasn't domestic terror, I don't know what is.
It's such an interesting point, Frank. I mean, is it because it's so unprecedented, or what is the playbook that judges are supposed to look to in cases like this?
We don't have a significant playbook or even predicate to look at in the law, because we're used to calling things that blow up for a political cause, literally bombings, arsons, as domestic terror. But when you think about it, the definition we have on the books for domestic terrorism is the use of force to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or a government to change their policy or conduct. Absolutely, that applies to trying to interfere with the peaceful transfer of power and how we've been doing it forever. So I think they're wrestling on the federal bench with what we saw the FBI and other agencies wrestle with prior to January 6th, which is, are we the threat? Could this really happen? Do these folks who kind of look like us, do they represent a threat to our democracy? And now we're seeing it, I think, play out on the federal bench.
No, one of the strategies, and I've heard you talk about this as well, of course, that from the Department of Justice in prosecuting or front-loading the prosecutions of so many of these insurrectionists was to deter additional political violence on behalf of Donald Trump. They've been criticized for that in some capacities. We haven't seen, fortunately, another gathering like what we saw around January 6th. But as a former law enforcement officer, well, I mean, what are you watching for? And is that something we should be calm about, or should we still be on guard about that potential?
Yeah, again, a couple of ways to look at it. Good news, bad news. There's no question if you monitor violent extremist websites, chat rooms, et cetera, where they hang out, the now over 1,000 arrests related to January 6th violence have had a chilling effect on people wanting to turn out. So there is a lot of chatter and talk and aspirational stuff going on, but I don't see the turnout at protest rallies, et cetera. So that's the good news. The not so good news relates, in fact, more to the Proud Boys, which, even though their leadership now is going to prison, I see membership increasing. I see them going local as a deliberate strategy. They now have 200 chapters around the country. They're showing up at PTA meetings and school board meetings. They're running for office. They're volunteering for election roles. And that raises the more serious question, are we developing a semi-permanent insurgency in this country? Not unlike what we saw in the battle against international terrorism. We took the leadership out of al-Qaeda, and what happened? The group decentralized. People could do their own thing on their own time when they saw the opportunity. That's even tougher for law enforcement to get in front of.
So given this is unprecedented in many ways, what can law enforcement be doing? It feels a little whack-a-mole to me, right, to try to track down and really follow and prevent these actions of grassroots leaders in different communities. What can they do?
That's the challenge looking ahead. And remember, they're handcuffed, no pun intended, by the lack of a domestic terror law that doesn't let them do what they do to prevent international terrorism, which is get proactive, use undercover agents, get court-ordered wiretaps and informants, et cetera. Not yet the case for domestic terrorism in a proactive nature. So what we need to see is a more transparent approach to threats. And we're starting to see it. You referenced the woman in Texas being arrested. The FBI tried to arrest Craig Robertson in Provo, Utah. He ended up dying because he allegedly swung a rifle at an FBI agent. We need more work against the threats to election workers in this country. There have only been 14 people charged in the last 2 years for threats against election workers, yet we know there's 1,000 cases that they're looking at right now. We need more of it. We need more of it from the state, county, and local level, which is not yet happening.
Frank, I just want to turn to Georgia for a moment. So Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis filed a new motion this week asking the judge to keep the identity of any jurors in the election trial secret. She wants to keep them secret from public eye. Their names could not be published, cameras in the courtroom would not film them, and media outlets would be barred from describing them. What is that makes sense, right, to protect their identities and protect their safety. What do you think the judge will look at, and what's your assessment of how they might rule in a case like that?
I think she laid out the evidence. I think DA Fani Willis absolutely made the case. The facts are there to support protecting this jury. Now, what's against the notion of doing it? Well, look, we're used to having a very open and free court process. The criminal process is open. Courtrooms are mostly open unless we're talking about a juvenile sensitive case. So that has to be weighed. But the threat is there, and the threat, as you're saying, is ratcheting up. We see even foreign powers alluded to in DA Willis's filing with the court. She says she's been told by law enforcement that some of the threats are coming from Russia and can't be traced or acted upon. So we're literally battling not only ourselves, but foreign adversaries with regard to the violent threat.
Now, you referenced some of the things you'd like to see happen in terms of additional steps to protect election workers. And you also referenced kind of the rise in political violence. I mean, according to Reuters, political violence in the U.S. is the worst it's been since the 1970s. Is there anything that the Bureau could be doing right now that you wish they were doing or that they had the power to do to combat this problem?
They've got a battle going on internally, kind of between a rock and a hard place. Their challenge is to protect our civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, not come out and start randomly, spying on Americans. We don't want that. The law doesn't permit them to do that. But here's where I would advocate. They need to take a more assertive posture on all threats and groups. And so, for example, we learned after the fact that on January 6th, just prior to January 6th, the FBI said publicly to NBC News that they did knock and talks to predicated subjects of domestic terror investigations, just telling them, we're on to you. You better not travel to Washington, D.C. on January 6th, because that could put you over the edge to charge you with something. We need more of that happening. It's time now not to sit back and watch, but rather to go forward and intervene before people act out violently.
Frank Figliuzzi, some important warnings you just gave all of us there of things to pay attention to. Thank you so much for your time today.